Today we're talking about the problem of accessibility and practicality in a lot of things in life that maybe are cool, but they're not useful. So one good example of this would be VR. I think VR headsets are pretty cool. I've got the Oculus 3, and when I got a new computer, I got the Oculus just because I wanted to try out Flight Simulator in VR, and I wanted to utilize my new computer to its fullest potential. And I thought one way to do that would be to get a VR headset and test it out, which I never had done before. So I got one, and I've had it for a while now, a few months. And the truth is, I really don't use it very much. I like playing Beat Saber with it. It's pretty cool. It's great for getting a little bit of gaming exercise in. And I will tell you that Flight Simulator is really amazing to check out in VR. If you haven't, could not recommend it enough. But there's a lot of truth in the fact that even if VR is cool, it's not something we use as much as we maybe would imagine, because you have to go put the goggles on your face and you're sitting there, and then if you wanted to look at your phone or you wanted to do something on your second computer screen or watch a movie on the side or have snacks on the desk that you're eating or coffee that you're drinking, or if somebody else was present, all of these are things that just don't really work very well with a VR headset. You're immersed in a game you're playing, but you can't just do something else on the side. If I was in a VR game right now, I wouldn't be able to make this video and just hang out and play a game and then have a video that I'm making on the side. It just wouldn't work. So there's so much that a VR headset doesn't work well with, that you wind up thinking this is going to be really cool, but then you don't really get as much quality use out of it as you would hope. And that's just one example of the same basic principle in life. I was in Seattle a couple weekends ago, and I remember what Seattle used to be like when I lived in that area about 5 years ago. It was a lot nicer in many ways. It was a lot nicer before. And the reason for this is that downtown used to be really more accessible for the average person. So let's just say you don't live or work downtown Seattle. You just are there for a day as a tourist or as somebody who lives in the outlying metropolitan area, and you're just popping in to have a good time and enjoy the vibe of the city. Well, there used to be a lot of random retailers that were there. There was the Barnes and Noble that was open till 11 o'clock at night. There was a Starbucks right in the middle of the shopping area that was also open until 11 o'clock at night. It felt pretty safe to be out and about. Yes, there were some homeless people that would be around the rescue mission and things like that, but it felt safe to just walk around downtown Seattle in the middle of the night. And I would do that. I wouldn't worry about it. It felt like there were places where you could go just hang out. You could sit around and just enjoy the ambiance of the city. You could find a cup of coffee at any time. You could just spend time there. And it wasn't hard to find a restroom or find a building that was just open. You could go into an office tower and take the elevator up to one of the upper floors. Even if it was a business, you could still probably go up and look out the window. It just felt pretty accessible. And now there's a lot more issues with crime and homelessness and just that general sense that everything is under lock and key or has to be secured or has to be patrolled by armed security. And a lot of the retail is gone. And so there's not really much reason to want to be downtown anymore, especially when you consider that there's flourishing malls and shopping opportunities and things like that outside of the retail core, outside of the downtown area. You know, I stayed there to go to the anime convention at the convention center, and I stayed at that hotel downtown. It was a Motif Hotel, I believe. And I paid $70 a night to park my car in the garage. Well, I could have gone down the street just a little ways out of town and parking would be free and breakfast would be free in the morning. But then you go downtown and now you're ultimately paying for a smaller room, and you're paying to park. You're paying for the security of a controlled access parking garage because it's not safe to have a vehicle on the street at night. You are paying for the convenience of having a breakfast at the hotel because there's not anywhere that you can go out to, you know, maybe just go have breakfast where it's safe. So maybe there's some things in that particular case, there's some things I would say over the last 5 years, while I haven't been there, there's some cool things about how Seattle has changed. There's some new buildings that have been built. There's infrastructure investments where around the waterfront, there's new parks being constructed. There's new pedestrian areas being constructed. There's new bike lanes that have been added, a lot of cool stuff. But the reality is that while maybe there's new buildings, you can't go inside them unless you have business to do there. There's not really anything to do if you don't have tickets to something, or you don't have an event you're going to, or you don't have a workplace there. It's just not really accessible to the average person because the everyday experience on the street is not safe. It's not good. It's not a positive experience. You know, like, it's just not cool when you go out in the morning. You just want to enjoy the morning, get a cup of coffee, and you have someone who's on drugs, you know, partially undressed out in the middle of the street swearing and screaming. Like, that's not the kind of environment where you would want to spend your time. So maybe the city's better in some ways, but if it's worse in all of the ways that contribute to the experience for everyday common tourists and visitors, then it doesn't really matter if there's a nice new office tower there, or if there's a new residential building which is super cool inside, because the average person isn't in there. The average person isn't benefiting from it. And I think sometimes we do start to see this principle of a walled garden, or sort of an ivory tower, where you have some people, maybe they're up in a nice building and they're in a controlled access sort of environment. Maybe you're spending time in a convention center or inside a hotel or something like that. But then the experience for the average person on the street continues to deteriorate in the city there. So the reality is I have a better experience in my small city here in Helena, Montana, because we don't have a major crime problem. We don't have major homelessness problems. We don't have that sense of not being able to safely walk around. Like here in my hometown, I'll go out at 12 or 1 o'clock at night, and I just enjoy spending time in the city, walking around, and it's quiet and it's safe, and I can get my steps in. I can hang around. There's no shortage of places where if you're walking around town, you can step into a a porta potty or a park restroom or any number of other things. If you needed to use a restroom and you weren't around your home, no problems in a town like the one I live in. But in Seattle, it would be a very different story. So, we could say, well, yeah, Seattle's a much better city in terms of big city amenities, but is it really? Because the truth of the matter is, in a small town like the one I live in, or small city rather, I have a much better, more walkable 15-minute city sort of experience than I would ever have in a big city like, as I was speaking of, Seattle. So, different examples, but kind of the same thing. VR headset that sounds cool, but you never use it. Big city that has tons of amenities, but the reality is you just stay in your car or in your hotel and you never actually go out because it's not really accessible or safe. You kind of have to look at things in life and not just say, well, what is this good or not? Because sometimes it's a little more nuanced than that. Things that are good aren't necessarily things that have the best benchmark. Sometimes they're just things that work better in our lives. So you have to gauge, what kind of experience am I getting out of this? Not just hard metrics of what has the most to offer. Maybe the VR headset is a more immersive experience than a legacy experience of using a normal computer screen, but it's not as practical. Maybe that city has a lot more amenities or things you can do, like going to see the opera or something, but maybe it's not as accessible or it's not as safe. So the end result is it's not a better experience to be there. A lot of times we look for, what is the best? What is the fastest? What is the strongest? And then we want to go with that. Imagine if you were going to have a military tank. So a tank is a strong piece of mobile armored cavalry, and you would say, well, give me the biggest and the strongest and the most powerful tank to go to battle with, and that's great. But is that going to be the most useful? In Germany in World War II, there was a mouse tank. They called it the mouse tank, M-A-U-S, mouse, and it was an enormous tank. Super cool. I really, really like the tank. In fact, I would like to get a Lego model of it or something of that nature eventually, but it was a really, really huge, epically big tank. And the reality was it was also not practical on the battlefield, because a smaller, more nimble tank that wouldn't get stuck in the mud as easily, something that could navigate and turn and accelerate more easily, was going to be a more useful unit on the battlefield. So that big tank was better than every other tank created in some ways, but its application was very specific. The environment which would allow it to be extremely useful was very specific, and so it wasn't adaptable. I also think about this with animals. So you could look at elephants, you can look at tigers, you could look at bears, you could look at any number of apex predators or really enormous, strong animals, and you'll actually find that almost always they're endangered. They are not adaptable. They can't survive in any environment. It has to be a very specific environment where they can find the type of prey that they need, or where the temperature is right, or where they don't have certain predators that would kill them, or where they don't have the wrong type of competition for food sources. So many things go into this. So if we were going to say, well, let's compare ourselves to animals, what kind of animal would you want to be? You might say, well, I would like to be strong and ferocious like a tiger. or I would like to be tanky like a bear or something like that. And that be that as it may, the reality is if you wanted to look at the animal kingdom for signs of success, you would look at animals like maybe a rat or maybe raccoons, animals that are very adaptable, that can survive in almost any circumstance, which are really good at creating cohabitation relationships with other species, that can have a symbiotic relationship with others and get along well with others. They're usually animals that are more conducive to domestication, which are more able to rely on smaller amounts of resources to succeed. A rat doesn't need a lot of anything to survive. It can just find a little bit of crumbs here or there and it'll be just fine. But try to feed a lion on a few crumbs and it will die. So small animals that you would think are mostly defenseless and mostly unimportant, well, they're going to be probably the invasive species that will survive and thrive in any environment, no matter how much people try to destroy them, kill them, hunt them, poison them, etc., etc. They will always be thriving and succeeding and continuing on. And then the big apex predators and top of the food chain kind of animals, those are the ones who are going to go extinct whenever something doesn't go their way. And I think we see this in life a lot too, where people who want to be really competitive, people who are always trying to figure out how they can get ahead, they're often the first ones to fail, because maybe they're the best at something, maybe they are super competitive, but they also only are able to succeed in a very specific environment. And as soon as they lose their edge in that particular way, then they're pretty much out of the game. But if you don't consume very much and you are able to adapt to any circumstance you find yourself in, you're probably going to be fine when a lot of other people are struggling with things. So I think it's great to just consider all of this and then say, well, what really adds value to my life? What really helps me to be more lightweight or more adaptable or more able to succeed in a broader spectrum of environmental circumstances? And then what things are more of that sort of a niche where it sounds really good, but the reality is it's not as useful as you would think it is. There's a lot of things that are peddled to us that somebody wants us to sign up for, and you'll see it, the as seen on TV advertisements, maybe you've seen them, where they're selling something like a, you know, some sort of a kitchen gadget or something, and it's going to tell you, well, if you get this, then it's going to be easier than ever for you to peel an apple effortlessly. So you need to get this special thing that's going to help you peel an apple. Well, okay, so are you really going to get that thing out to peel the apple for you? Or are you just going to use the same basic knife that you always would have used, because the little knife works just fine for everything? But the specialized, as seen on TV, apple peeler is not necessarily going to be as heavily used long term. Or maybe it's a slinky hose, a little hose, and the hose is going to be great because it is something that can be, maybe it's more compact, or maybe it is more bendy than a regular hose, or something like that. But the reality is, long term, you're probably going to use the basic hose that you got out of the garden center, that's just a normal hose that works just fine. You're not going to actually get the years of use out of the as seen on TV one so much. It's going to sound good in the commercial. It's going to make you think, yeah, I should sign up for that. But in the end, you're not really going to use it so much. I experienced this with things like Steam games in the workshop. You look in there and there's a bunch of games that are super cool and you think, oh my goodness, I want to play that. And then you install it and you don't ever really play it again, because even though it's cool, it's not as cool as those few main titles that you wind up coming back to again and again, because those tried and true titles that are maybe more generally fun, easier to just get into, well, those are sticky and you always go back to the ones that work. And then there's the ones that just don't, and you think you want to play them, but you don't play them very much because something about them isn't really as sticky. They're not as broadly fun, they're not as broadly accessible. Whatever it is, it sounds really good to sign up for something new, but quite often that something new winds up being far less sticky than you would expect it to be. And then in the end, you're going back to the tried and true thing that you've always gone back to. That's not the best at everything. It's not the newest. It's not as cutting edge necessarily, but it is proven to be a good experience. And then you realize, well, I'd rather have something that's good all around, that is reliable and trustworthy, than something that is perfect in some ways but grossly deficient in others. And so I'll close with this thought. I've always liked that saying, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And quite often we will tend to look for things that seem to be more perfect than what we have. We have that grass is always greener on the other side of the fence experience. And we overlook the fact that something that's perfect in some ways but extremely deficient in others will ultimately always be at a disadvantage versus something which is generally good and maybe not perfect, but tried and true. Many times in life, there's going to be gimmicks. There's going to be new things that enter our life or enter our focus, and then there's going to be the things that we can always come back to. Maybe it's that game that just feels familiar, and even if it's not perfect in every way, it has a leg up on that new shiny game that also doesn't feel like it has a lot of soul. Or maybe it's a person who isn't perfect in every way, but they are a person who's always been there for you, who you can count on to be there for you in the future. So that's going to be the person who you cherish, not the one who's just the prettiest face, or perhaps the smartest, or the most successful superficially. It's going to be the one you can count on, the person who adds consistent value to your life. There's people who will be really amazing to be around, but then it's hit and miss whether they're actually going to be there for you. They might be there for you, they might just ghost you. You just never really know if they're going to be present or if they're going to be suspiciously absent. They're those fair weather friends, and if you have those, then you'll come to the realization that you'd rather have somebody who's a good friend than someone who is a good looking friend, because things we can count on every day, things that we can use all the time, are much better than things which just seem like a good idea, but which don't really actually deliver value in our lives. Always try to seek out the difference between those, know the difference between those, and don't buy into everything. It's been said that it doesn't matter how cheap something is. If it's not something that you need in your life, there is no price low enough to make it worth having it. I went into the thrift store the other day because there's a little thrift store here in my neighborhood, and it will occasionally offer everything in the store for $1 day. So I was there and I went in, looked around, and I reached the conclusion, interestingly, that there was nothing in that store that I wanted, even for $1. And that's not to say that there wasn't anything that was nice in there. There wasn't anything that was useful. There certainly was. It's just there was nothing that I needed. There was nothing that I would use. There was nothing that was on my list of things that I would benefit from having. So I walked out without buying anything, because even if it was all free, it doesn't really matter if it's free if you don't actually need it. Maybe sometimes that's just a reminder that every time there's a Steam sale, you don't necessarily have to buy a game if you're not actually going to play it. Things that are important, you don't really have to make a case for why. You just know that they're a good quality part of your life. And if you don't know that, then they probably aren't. Just like all of the things that you might have in your house. If you can go a year without using something, it probably wouldn't be a terrible idea to part ways with it, to travel lighter, and to eliminate some of the liabilities that you think you need, which really just kind of weigh you down. Travel light. Always go out of your way for the things that matter, but don't spend your life chasing things that you aren't certain will add value in your life. As always, good luck on your adventure. Thank you for watching.